Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Carmen Blair, the Deputy Director of the San Mateo County Historical Association, and I would like to welcome you to today's courthouse docket. Held here in the building's historic courtroom A, the courthouse docket is a series of lectures and performances sponsored by Cypress Lawn Heritage Foundation. Each month, we explore a different aspect of local history. When I was conducting oral histories for the renovation of our immigrants exhibit, a common comment from several of the interviews was, "We were not allowed to live there." For decades, throughout the peninsula, there was restrictions on who could live in certain neighborhoods and communities. Today, we are pleased to have with us Gene Slater. He has served as Senior Advisor on Housing for federal, state, and local agencies for over 40 years. He co-founded and chairs CSG Advisors, which has been one of the nation's leading advisors on affordable housing for decades. He has worked on housing and major development efforts in more than 30 states, including serving as San Francisco's advisor on the reuse of the ferry building in Mission Bay. His projects have received numerous national awards, and in the aftermath of the 2009 financial crisis, he helped design the program by which the U.S. Treasury financed homes for 110,000 first-time buyers. He received degrees from Columbia, MIT, and Stanford, a traveling fellowship to the London School of Economics, and a mid-career Loeb Fellowship in Environmental Design from Harvard, awarded to 10 architects and planners globally each year. He is the author of the book, Freedom to Discriminate, How Realtors Conspired to Segregate Housing and Divide America. Copies of the books will be on sale following the presentation. At this time, please welcome Gene Slater.
Thank you so much. So my message today is a simple one. It's to show the deep connection between two fundamental defining features of modern America, features that are rarely looked at together: the creation of residential segregation in every city in the country, and of a conservative counter-idea of American freedom, of freedom without regard to the rights of others, that was created in the 1960s and has shifted America to the right for more than 50 years. Both of these innovations were designed to divide Americans. Both were constructed by a private business trade organization, the nation's Realtors, to sell homes and maintain their business practices. By looking at them together, you look at the story of 20th and 21st century America is not a story of barriers being reduced, but of barriers being created. And so step by step from the Realtors archives, I want to show how that happened. So what stands out from the story are that segregated neighborhoods were new. This was a 20th century invention, invented much in the same way as the airplane, and about the same time. And like so many American innovations, much of its story takes place here in California. Far from impacting only those that excluded, segregation dramatically reshaped the country for everyone. Its pioneers helped create city planning and zoning. Their design of federal programs to exclude minorities shaped where all the neighborhoods, almost all the neighborhoods of the country, and where people live today and who their neighbors are. And more deeply still, the Realtors constructed many of the most intractable divides, not only geographic and racial, but social, economic, and ideological that divide us today. So the story of modern America is in many ways, I think, the story of these divides. And residential segregation, its legacy, therefore, its compounded legacy now, was not peripheral to the creation of modern America, but very much is the center of the story. This is not how I studied planning and zoning and other things. This was not, it's always seemed to me, this was some side issue that only affected certain people. My argument is this really structured the country for everybody in lots of ways. And that's because restricting the burgeoning free market economy in real estate in this country required enormous effort, and it transformed our institutions, because to racially divide every housing market, the organized real estate industry, which is what the realtors were, needed to enlist all, the country's leading lawyers, economists, newspapers, universities, lenders, courts. All of them were enlisted by the real estate industry to do this. And the system's so effective that by 1960, African Americans were excluded from 98% of new homes and 95% of neighborhoods. So, at the heart of segregation and how it worked were the justifications that realtors created. I think of them as myths that were created to adjust to the country's changing values. And so in this story that I'm going to tell, it's a story of justifications, decade after decade, as the country's values changed and the realtors figured out different ways to repackage the same basic idea, but in new language. And in order to see themselves not as white supremacists, but as upholding the American dream, with lasting impacts on all of us today and what we take for granted. So before tracing the history, let me describe a couple of the myths that realtors promoted. One was that segregation always existed. But if you look back in the records, if you go back to the beginning of the 20th century, racially mixed neighborhoods were common both south and north. And most minorities lived in cheaper areas. These were racially mixed and dispersed as well. And where one could live depended on where one could afford and not one's ancestry. And in a world before zoning, often classes were mixed as well in types of dwellings. A second myth was that segregation was natural. Birds of a feather flock together. And most minorities, but as every study has shown, people of all groups have always sought to disperse to find better opportunities. So that doesn't explain this desire to somehow live only among your own kind. Nor was segregation due to lack of income. It forced minorities to pay 20 to 30% more for the same quality housing because they couldn't move to less costly white areas alongside. There's an excellent study of San Diego in the 1950s that shows exactly this. And this is true all over the country. And at every individual income level, African Americans have been half as likely to be able to move to the suburbs as whites. So it's not a function simply of income. And if these weren't myths, realtors wouldn't have worked hard. They wouldn't have had to do anything in order to keep minorities from moving into our white neighborhoods. So this is a story of a creation from which these myths were used to normalize what was happening. Nor is it simple, can you simply say segregation was the result of racism? I mean, obviously racism is at its heart, but that doesn't explain how it got created or why it got created, because racism was certainly as strong in 1900 as it was in 1920 or 1940 or 1960. It took something else to create segregation, and what it took was a newly organized real estate industry. So it took the creation of the realtors, now today the National Association of Realtors, and all the local real estate boards. So who were they? In the early 1900s, the most established real estate brokers in just about every major city in the country, Los Angeles 1903, San Francisco 1904, Berkeley 1905, and Denver a little before, and so forth. The most established real estate brokers in each major city organized themselves as local real estate boards to distinguish themselves from and deal with fraud, which was rampant. This was the Wild West of real estate, as realtors have called this period. No licensing, no rules. There was a Supreme Court justice who asked in a hearing, an oral hearing, said, if a man under a cloud can't go into real estate, where in God's name can he go? So real estate was seen as the land of shysters. and no written listings. You could come in with, you quoted all sorts of commissions and then change them. And so these local boards, the most socially prominent real estate men, they were all men for the first 20 years, would establish and charge for trust. So the slogan, the headline, when they formed their national association, the local papers, was "Realty men band together to kill sharks." Sharks was the image of that's what ordinary real estate men are, but we're going to select a small number of brokers. In Los Angeles, for example, it was 50 of the 2,000 people who were buying and selling real estate were allowed to join the original board. These board members, socially prominent, saw themselves as business progressive reformers in the mold of Teddy Roosevelt, and creating, this was what progressivism meant. So it's a different meaning of progressive than today, but it's important to understand how people saw themselves. And so they created what they called organized real estate. Written exclusive listings, state licensing, fixed commissions. They created the multiple listing service with shared commissions, like listing on a stock exchange. In fact, many of these local boards called themselves real estate exchanges, because that was the image. You have a seat on an exchange, and you post a little card, like a stock, individual listings. And they all saw themselves as private clubs who blackballed applicants and whose power lay in their exclusiveness. They thought that was the key to regulating the industry and controlling it and to making themselves its leaders. And for 60 years, until the 1960s, every real estate board in America was entirely white. Nobody else was allowed. By 1920, their proprietary multiple listing service had proven so powerful it enabled these small boards to double real estate commissions. They went from 3% to 6% overnight and imposed this and made, as they proclaimed in their journals, and we made it stick because they controlled 80% of home sales or lot sales in the country. And they trademarked the name Realtors, and becoming politically powerful. 2 realtors became governors of California, first in the 1920s. They helped create zoning. And now we think of realtors simply as somebody selling your individual home. But this was an institution that enlisted as associate members the leading banks and title companies. It organized brokerage, land development, home building. The National Association of Home Builders came out of the realtors. Apartment management, the Management Institute comes out of that. Appraisals, the Appraisal Institute comes out of this organization. Real estate education in every university in the country. So all of this came from these small local real estate boards that banded together. Now, across each of these fields, realtors held 3 core beliefs about the source of value of real estate and of each realtor's business. And these become important to understand how segregation works. First was that the value of a house or a lot wasn't so much a function of what was there, but what could happen around it. The surroundings mattered, sort of neighborhood approach to appraisals, which dominates the industry today. Second, as with creating licensing and zoning, realtors believed not in individual freedom, just the opposite. They believed in subordinating individual freedom, the right to buy and sell as you wish, to create stability, order, and predictability, all based on what they called the law of conformity. Namely, buildings of a certain type had to be together, people of a certain type had to be together, that the source of stability in real estate values was conformity. This was the essence of their idea. And finally, they identified, as progressives and voluntary earthworkers, they identified their own future customer base, the people who would rehire them, with the public interest as they saw it. And their constant slogan was doing well by doing good. So they saw themselves as benefiting and representing the community as a whole and speaking for the common good, which was, of course, identical with their own. They soon began to use these core beliefs to begin racially separating housing markets. Now, these didn't exist in 1904 when a black real estate agent wrote The Negroes of this city have prudently refused to segregate themselves into any locality, but have scattered and purchased homes in areas with the best services and surroundings. That's 1904. 1917, a black woman who was saying in Los Angeles says, "We've been surrounded by invisible walls of steel. The whites surrounded us and made it impossible to go beyond these walls." And these walls began not as an enormous plan or design, but rather a way to solve a development financing problem. And a development financing problem which Berkeley, California, is at the center. So, starting in 1905, a few of the most successful realtors were the leaders of local real estate boards. Duncan McDuffie, developing park-like high-end subdivisions. Claremont in Berkeley was the first. St. Francis Wood in San Francisco. Created covenants that all lot buyers signed, so that in a world without zoning, each buyer would know what could happen next. And the first of these had been created in outside of Baltimore in the 1890s. Didn't involve race. Involved, could you tear down the street? Could you tear down the trees? How far back did you have to set the house? What was its minimum square footage? Minimum size. You couldn't have apartments. You couldn't have an undertaking parlor. You couldn't have a brothel. So it limited what could be built. And a developer they designed these and they recorded these because as a developer who's doing Claremont Park, unlike normal little paper subdivisions where they just recorded and the streets may not materialize, is very common in this era. They were making a major investment in buying a large area and putting in expensive streets and infrastructure. So to return their investment and to make a profit, it wasn't on the first lots they were going to sell, it was on the last lots they were going to sell, 5 years or 7 years later. They wanted to capture the value of that area remaining attractive, and that's why they recorded covenants. But McDuffie, who was an ardent environmentalist, twice for many years national president of the Sierra Club. He created the Save the Redwoods League in California. He was the first Parks Commissioner of California. He had another covenant to convey status. So this property shall not be occupied by any person not of the Caucasian race. We'll get to what Caucasian means, except a certain. Now, it was hardly likely that any of the few Japanese immigrants in San Francisco or Bay Area in 1905 or blacks could afford the most expensive house lots in the entire Bay Area. So this racial covenant was really more a way of adding cachet. Marketing, and this was their slogan, your children will always play with children like them. And McDuffie then, a few years later, he could only control his own property, of course, by recording these. So he then, as chairman of the planning board in Berkeley, created the first single-family zoning in America. And that zoning was designed, it wasn't zoning the entire city or anything else, it was designed precisely to prevent a Negro dance hall from being located in Elmwood, a few blocks downhill from Claremont. So that's the origins of single-family zoning in this country. So you'll see it as a complement to racial exclusion. Now, using this same approach, J.C. Nichols in Kansas City created the first homeowners associations in the country. Where do homeowners associations come from? They come from J.C. Nichols' Country Club Estate. It says here, Country Club District, 1,000 acres restricted, the largest restricted neighborhood in America. And he lectured developers nationally on what he called planning for permanence, which was what this was. And his salesman learned, when buyers first objected and said, well, I'm sorry, this seems un-American. I'm buying a piece of land and you're telling me what I can do with it? That seems like, some of my freedom. The salesman explained, the restrictions on you mean little. It's the restrictions on your neighbors which count. And instead of finding it hard to sell lots with restrictions, they found they could hardly sell them without them. And McDuffie and Nichols became two of the most honored developers and leaders of city planning in America. McDuffie has a mountain named after him. Nichols has this fountain in Kansas City. They're thinking about renaming it. And get this, from 2000 to 2021, the Urban Land Institute, the highest organization of major developers in the country, named the country's highest award in land development for J.C. Nichols. That's how prominent these people were and how honored they were. McDuffie was honored by the mayor of Berkeley. His subdivisions, he built racially restricted subdivisions for 100,000 people in the Bay Area. His company, you can still see the signs, Mason McDuffie. That's McDuffie. This racial covenant cost the developer nothing and proved so popular that they were soon used in almost all high-end subdivisions, and then within a couple of years, like in Beverly Hills, for example, in a few years on most middle-class subdivisions, Culver City in Los Angeles was an example, and then working-class subdivisions. And then, by the early 1910s, we're talking only like a matter of 7 or 8 years, realtors in existing neighborhoods began circulating petitions so that these too would have covenants limiting who could ever live there. As long as, once 75% of the people in the area signed it, it meant they could sue it. You could be sued if you or anybody else you sold to ever had a non-Caucasian living there. And this caught on like wildfire. This was it cost developers nothing to do this, and it became a popular marketing device, originally helping create a premium, in land value, but eventually it became so normal. This was like just the norm. And so by the 1920s, half the homes in the country had covenants, and virtually all newer subdivisions. So they created a new possibility in this country. A product which was racially exclusive neighborhoods. That wasn't something one could buy or assure before this. And by 1920, realtors, their ad hoc success in beginning to racially separate markets created new and unexpected roles. Realtors found that they had become racial gatekeepers in each neighborhood simply by the business practice. They became looked to by the people they had sold homes to, by homeowners associations, by local officials, to protect, as the people to protect all white areas. And there were efforts at local zoning ordinances to zone by race in Baltimore and St. Louis and Louisville. Those were outlawed by the Supreme Court in 1917 as being government action enforcing, in violation of the 14th Amendment. So segregation now depended on realtors and covenants. And so realtors in effect wound up taking on this role of not only salesmen, but anti-salesmen. And there are amazing records online through the Hoover Institute at Stanford. A study a Stanford professor did in 1927 in which he asked for a confidential survey of all the real estate boards in the state through the state association. And they asked members of a set of boxes and said, check off which group do you have the most trouble or focus on if excluded? Negro, Chinese, Japanese, Mexican. And then there was space for other. And what you see, and then what do you do about it? So you can see often it was a different problem. They were defined as a different problem in certain areas. In Santa Monica, the problem was defined as the Western Negro. In Sonoma County board, it was Japanese. We don't have problems with anybody else. In Riverside, it was the problem is blacks want to live, or Negroes want to live in a better place. We have no problem with Mexicans somewhere else, and so forth. So they designed their efforts, and they created one place in San Jose was called. They said we created a MEDAX committee, whose job was to make certain even if a home sale went through, we would buy it out from under them, we would stop the sale, we'd force people out. So this was they became, through the local real estate board, the way of enforcing these. This also happened at a municipal level. I said zoning couldn't be racial. But if you look at a place like Glendale, which since the 1950s proclaimed itself, 100% American city, the all-American city. And Glendale, realtors served on the planning board who approved subdivisions. Nobody could get a subdivision approved if it didn't have racial covenants on it. So these things worked hand in glove. But how could local real estate boards, remember their members are still only a minority of all the brokers in the area, and you don't have to sell a home to a broker. How can they keep even a single minority from buying homes? Remember, the principle they were selling was that you have to exclude any minority, that even one will ruin the neighborhood. This is the way San Jose put it when a Chinese herb doctor moved in on First Street in San Jose. And they said, you know, he's ruined the neighborhood for everybody else. He's taken away. So they needed a rationale and a definitive, unarguable, objective, scientific-sounding rationale why neighborhoods had to be segregated. And to do this, realtors led nationally by Herbert U. Nelson for more than 30 years. They created an axiom, a principle, that, and this is the phrase, undesirable human elements drive down prices. So in 1920, Portland, Oregon's board announced its members would not, quote, under any circumstances, sell property in white areas to Negroes or Orientals, not on account of any prejudice, for it has none, but because it is common knowledge they greatly depreciate in the public mind surrounding property values. So here was a foolproof argument for getting neighbors to pressure sellers next door who could be against, you know, protecting property values. This proposition was incorporated as economic objective truth in every real estate textbook, every appraisal manual in the United States for the next 30 years, almost all of which were written or published by the Realtors Real Estate Education platform. And they would say things like, decline, you know, prices will decline by 50%, or prices will decline by 30%, and this is well established. We're going to find out later what this turned out to be based on. In 1924, the Realtors then added, this is Article 34 of their Code of Ethics, a national ethics standard, which was that no realtor could ever introduce any race or nationality whose presence will clearly be detrimental to property values in the neighborhood. And then they suspended, expelled, or froze out of the entire business any broker who violated that for the next 40 years. And in fact, this rule required knowledge on state licensing exams in California. You have to be able to show how you can apply this. And the Realtors National Training Manual sort of went out of its way to emphasize, despite any moral concerns you have, why you had to uphold this. So here's the phrase. No respectable broker will represent a bootlegger, a madam with call girls on her string, or a colored man of means who was giving his children a college education and thought they were entitled to live among the whites, since any of these would instigate a form of blight. So they equated these. This was the one time in the entire history of realtors when this became disclosed in a black newspaper in Pittsburgh during World War II. They found a copy of this, and they sort of said, oh, well, this doesn't really, we apologize, this isn't really what we meant. But it wasn't like they were being egregiously racist. They were explaining, if you thought somebody, black doctor, could live in an area, no, you can't assume that. This is how they trained young people in the industry. In the country's leading appraisal text, said, what are the implications? Said, the colored people certainly have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but they must recognize the economic disturbance their presence causes and forego their desire to split off from where the rest of their race lives. They would have to sacrifice their future, their children's, their grandchildren's, their great-grandchildren's, because this was simply economic truth. And in 1934, as the New Deal responded to the Depression, and property values being down by 50%, 25% of homes being foreclosed, they used this property value axiom to institutionalize segregation. The realtors nationally were the chief lobbyists, the designers, and the key staff of the Federal Housing Administration, which provided 100% federal mortgage insurance. And they they drafted the underwriting rules to measure risk by the presence of minorities. And realtors viewed FHA, they called it their agency of the government, and its creation their greatest accomplishment. And in many ways, it transformed the mortgage industry, became, created billions of dollars of value. And the way, we're accustomed to these redlining maps. First of all, until 25 years ago, nobody public had ever seen a copy of these until Kenneth Jacks at Columbia uncovered these. So these were kept locked and secret and numbered. So don't take for granted that everybody sort of knew about these. And how were these designed? So the FHA didn't have some middle depression, they don't have a staff. So they created a local office in each city, and they asked 3 local realtors who happened to be all at least 50 years old and with 25 years experience to create maps showing what the risk factors were in that neighborhood over the last 25 years. In order to project where were the risk factors going to be over the next 25 years, because they're making 25-year loans, which was unheard of. At the time you wanted a mortgage, it was like 10 years or 5 years, which is what resulted in all the foreclosures and depression. So these redlining maps basically said FHA won't make a loan to anyone in these red areas, so there'll be no investment in those, in these mixed areas. And it won't make a loan to any minority buying outside these areas. So the result was basically made no loans to minorities, except in a couple of areas in the South and black areas, neighborhoods. And these rules were entirely secret. It took the NAACP like 5 years to uncover and even find the rules, which they never found the redlining maps. And of course, to spur construction during the Depression, 3/4 of FHA lending went to new construction. And they required as a condition, they would give you as a developer, picture this, they would give you as a developer a commitment to guarantee, ensure 100% of the loans that would be made on that subdivision. At times, this is a time when home builders typically built like 10 homes a year. People usually bought lots and then they sort of built on them over time and found a contractor. But if you could get 100% commitment on all the loans to buyers, you could go to the bank with that and be able to get bank financing in the middle of the Depression, get short-term construction financing from the bank, often for 90, often 100 or 105% of the actual cost of development. So suddenly home builders became able to build 1,000 homes a year or 5,000 homes a year because they now had the financial wherewithal to do it without any of their own cash. But to do that, the requirement for conditional commitment was you had to prove that the subdivision you were creating was not subject to risk factors. It was not located near minorities or it had racial covenants. Okay? This was the requirement of the federal government, run with the head of mapping, the head of underwriting, head of marketing for FHA, all were key members of the realtor education story. Okay. And the natural result is if government takes 100% of the risk on these new areas, money flows into them, and there's no money going into the old neighborhoods, which they won't lend in. So this is simply a natural result. And the results were, as I started my career in the 1970s, working in cities all over the country, it looked like these were, every city seemed designed the same way in terms of who lived where. This was the result of this institutional organization. There weren't black ghettos to begin with. What happened was there were mixed neighborhoods. Then there were new neighborhoods that were created that had to be excluding non-Caucasians. And originally that meant Jews, meant Italians, depending on the area. San Jose, they allowed Italians, Long Island, they didn't. Just about every group you can imagine. In fact, an argument before the Supreme Court by a Sikh from India claimed he was more closely descended from Caucasians than any white person, and the Supreme Court said, for purposes of this rule, you're not a Caucasian. But gradually, we get into the 1940s, particularly after World War II, as Jews, Italians, Poles, Greeks are allowed to be seen as white, meaning they're allowed by realtors to buy into these neighborhoods. These older mixed race areas, the areas left behind, become almost entirely African American, not by anybody's choosing, but simply they were the only people who couldn't move out. So FHA's racial system was a self-fulfilling prophecy. The dumping grounds resulting from disinvestment then became blamed on those who prevented from living anywhere else. But beginning in World War II, realtors faced new ideological challenges in maintaining separate markets. For one thing, studies, even from appraisers by the Realtors Appraisal Institute, came to the conclusion that property values actually, when they were measured, didn't go down. And why? You can imagine, because if people are forced to pay a hell of a lot more living where they're living, they're going to be forced to pay more, often by taking in roomers and paying speculators a 20 to 30% differential to buy into a white neighborhood. So prices maintain themselves not with white owners, but with those moving in. So Luigi Laurenti at Berkeley in the 50s, later on, went back and he went to he did a study showing this. In 2/3 of the cases, property values went up. And so we went back to the author of every textbook in the country that had proclaimed this property value axiom and said, can I just see the evidence, the studies that show this? Turned out, as he said to Congress, there were no studies, and I looked very hard. So the fundamental rule is appraisers and textbook writers, like the realtors themselves, focused only on what white buyers could buy because that was their customer base. The rest of the market didn't exist in this view. They simply segregated the notion of value and the notion of prices in the same way they had segregated the markets to begin with. So the building of mid-century America and the government mortgage lending system that prevented minorities accumulating wealth in this country was based on a lie. There's no two ways about this. But post-war realtors faced a still greater problem than the discrediting of this property value axiom, and that was World War II had been fought in the name of a common American freedom that led black and white Americans alike to line up to see gleaming freedom trains with the Constitution and the National Archives and the Declaration of Independence that would show up at every train station in the country. And to ask why minority veterans who had risked their lives for their country couldn't live in the home they had bought. That was what covenants prevented. It was actually living, it was occupying the home. They could buy a home in California, they just couldn't live in it. And so in response, we get more into the political nature of this story. In September 1947, Charlie Shattuck, who's known nationally as Mr. Realtor, president of the local Los Angeles board, which is the largest in the country, in California, and in the national board. He's addressing a raucous meeting of West Side homeowners on the west side of Los Angeles because their homeowner associations are trying to get people to enforce covenants and sue minority veterans who are buying homes now. And he had explained why they couldn't sell to GIs with Purple Hearts. So he used a new argument. He was a leading appraiser. The nation's appraisal honor, the highest appraisal honor in the country, is named after Shattuck to this day. So he knew property values had been discredited. So instead he invoked what he called freedom of association, which was the right to exclude other races. Under the Constitution, we're all equally set. Non-Caucasians can buy anywhere the same as whites. But it's also constitutional for any group to band together and agree that no member of any other group should live there. Koreans may utilize this, Chinese, Negroes, so may pure Caucasians. It's unfortunate that white owners had to work against men who fought first in the war, but we can't let the bars down to anyone. And he said, this is not merely a right, this is an obligation. I could sell out and buy a home somewhere else, but I wouldn't be doing my duty as a patriotic citizen. So this notion of freedom of association, this freedom to exclude, had no legal basis. It wasn't in the Constitution. No court had ever upheld such a racial right. But it became a way to mobilize neighbors in the name of American freedom. And this, at the same time that Shattuck was addressing these West Side homeowners, a different story and a different enemy, subversion of covenants, which if you look back at the beginning of World War II, you said this racial system would just naturally continue forever, right? I mean, it's sort of unchallenged, it controls the textbooks, it controls the appraisals, it controls the sales, it controls the lenders, FHA, it's a whole perfect system. And it was these things started becoming the rifts. And the second rift was that Isaac Woodard, who was a black officer, was discharged from a military base in South Carolina in 1946. And he talks back to the bus driver on a Greyhound bus, and he's put off the bus, and the local mayor and police chief gouges out his eyes. And the head of the NAACP later is at a meeting with the White House and describing this isn't the only incident. And Truman calls up his attorney general that day and says, "Can we create a high-level presidential committee on civil rights?" There's never been such a thing. There had never been such a thing. And he appoints very high-level people to this. The head of president of GE is the head of the board, heads of major universities, and so forth. And he says, "I want the Bill of Rights implemented in fact." And this high-level report comes back and calls segregation not only Jim Crow in the South, but racial covenants and realtor discrimination in the North. Quote, "the greatest impediment to American freedom." Freedom, the committee said, required government to protect the equal rights of all. So the committee's most immediate recommendation that Truman acted on the next day was to do what the federal government had never done, which is intervene in a lawsuit among private parties. And so it took the side of the NAACP in a court case that challenged racial covenants. And basically what the court held, could have held this 50 years earlier, was simply that if the court is enforcing a racial covenant, that's an action of government, and therefore it's state action under the 14th Amendment. So they were prohibited. Now, in response, there were all sorts of efforts to deal with this. So Los Angeles Realtors, real estate board, proposed a U.S. constitutional amendment to overturn the 14th Amendment. And the California Realty Board did the same. And said, in the interest of fairness, assure separate areas where each race could, quote, enjoy the pursuit of happiness, to prevent Negroes from, quote, menacing the family life of the nation as we have enjoyed it. This is in the same year apartheid began in South Africa. But on the advice of their counsel, the National Association, after a few months of publicizing this idea, dropped it because their lawyers said there are more effective, quieter ways you can continue segregation. You can do it by racial steering and basically your code of ethics and freezing people out of the business. We don't have to have constitutional. And this, in fact, went on. I was at Daly City a couple of months ago at Westlake, which had the largest homeowner association in California, Henry Dolger. So his approach was said, well, the court said you can't enforce racial covenants against minorities. So instead, there was a covenant which said it was only selling to white buyers. And he said, okay, if you sell to a minority, then you pay $2,000 each to each of your 8 neighbors. For each of your neighbors, $16,000. The cost of a home in Westlake was about $16,000. So pay the entire value of your home if you want to sell it to a minority. And this went on for about another 6 years before the Supreme Court finally overturned that too. Okay, so let me, where's Wesley? The one thing I want to say, because it's important to the last part of this, is that this same notion of freedom of association was being trumpeted and developed at the same time as Charlie Shattuck and the realtors around the country by Southerners to protect Jim Crow. And this guy, Charles Wallace Collins, you may not have heard of, but he wrote an amazing book in 1947 that basically said, unless Democrats, Southern Democrats, leave the Democratic Party and join with those Northern Republicans who, in a common party that will be united against regulation of business, federal regulation of business, and federal regulation of civil rights. And this led to the Dixiecrat Rebellion in 1948 and Strom Thurmond running for president. It took 20 years for this to come to fruition. But as it came to fruition in the 1960s, you'll see how it connects back to this realtor story I'm telling you. Okay, so this use of freedom of association, as a result, and people signing petitions against minorities living in areas and racial steering, was so effective so powerful, it only intensified. So, in fact, the likelihood of blacks living with whites in Los Angeles went down in the 15 years after Shelley versus Graham. And to give you a flavor, 325,000 new homes in the Bay Area in the 1950s, 50 were sold without regard to race. I'll give you some flavor in the pure intensity of this. So in response, the NAACP and other groups who had fought and thought Shelley was going to solve their problem, they now banded together to create a little organization, National Council Against Discrimination in Housing, that worked out of a bedroom, the office the size of a bedroom in New York with like 3 staff people. And they started promoting fair housing ordinances and magazines and promoted equal rights committees, fair housing committees, in cities across the country. It kept spreading like wildfire in the 50s and early 60s. And the result was fair housing got adopted by New York City in '57, by other places. And the central battle over fair housing, and a battle that shaped America today in many ways, took place in California in 1963 and early '64. So the state passed its first fair housing law with teeth. It was under Governor Pat Brown's law, sponsored by Byron Rumford, pharmacist from Berkeley, was an assemblyman. And it was a very modest law. It covered 25% of single-family homes, and it covered rentals, and it imposed a $500 fine if you violated it. That was sort of. And in some states, in Colorado and Massachusetts, the state Realtors Association said, all right, we can live with this. We'll make it, we'll try and see if we can make it. Not in California, not in most places. So in California, the state association, picture, led by Spike Wilson, who was a realtor from Fresno, a brilliant propagandist, a former newspaperman from the Sacramento Bee. They put together a campaign to put a state constitutional amendment on the ballot in 1964 that would prohibit the state or any city or county from ever restricting the right to discriminate in real estate, residential real estate. And so their problem was, this is 1963 and 1964, the Civil Rights Act is going through Congress, large majority support in California. It's the height of support for civil rights. This is the same election in which Lyndon Johnson wins by 60% of the largest, still by far the largest landslide in American history. On the same ballot, the realtors are saying there should be a permanent right to discriminate. There's nothing in any state constitution, even in the Deep South. And so they were totally politically isolated. No major politician would support them, not Barry Goldwater, not Ronald Reagan for fear of seeming racist. Every Catholic archbishop, just about every religious leader, the unions, even their longtime allies, the Los Angeles Chamber of Commerce, when they first had their meetings in LA, the realtors, they refused to endorse this. So they're totally politically isolated. So how do they, and they're up against a popular 2-term governor, so how do they argue for such an amendment? So they invented, basically, the concept of colorblind freedom. And they said, freedom of conscience is what's at stake here. And so on the billboards in Los Angeles, on the freeways, it said freedom of choice. This is what's being threatened. Your freedom of choice as a seller to sell to whom you want based on your own conscience. You may hear echoes of these stories today in lots of other domains. And they proclaim this as being the equivalent, in many ways, the same as freedom of religion. Right? And it had to be absolute. Remember, this is the realtors who for 50 years have been restricting the rights of sellers as to who they can sell to. Okay? So, but what had happened was government was now on the other side. So we have to prevent government. So they created this notion of an absolute notion of freedom, and they advertised the Property Owners' Bill of Rights that Wilson drafted. And it said there are absolute rights. These are the basis of American freedom. The purpose of the American Revolution had been fought to allow your absolute right to your home. And the image of American freedom was a picket fence around your home, or the house key. And they portrayed themselves as, Paul Revere. And so what they argued was, you don't need to be racially biased to support this proposition, just the opposite. You have to believe in American freedom. So most Californians didn't want to see themselves as racially biased, and they supported this. So this, on the same ballot, this received 65% of the vote. 75% of the white vote in California, 80% of the white non-Jewish vote. To make clear how compelling this argument was, when pollsters called people in lots and asked them what they read them the ballot proposition, which is drafted in the language of the Bill of Rights. The state shall never abridge. And they said, well, what do you think of this? 60% of African Americans in lots said, well, we're for that. That sounds good. Until somebody explained to them what it was. So that gives you the sense of the power of this argument. I don't want to make a joke. This is a truly powerful argument that's had enormous implications for the country. Because basically, what Martin Luther King had argued in the March on Washington was that freedom belonged to the country as a whole, so freedom was indivisible. To take away freedom from anybody threatened it for everybody. This was the exact opposite argument. This was an argument that freedom is a zero sum. In fact, this is what they said. This is reducing your freedom to give it to others who are unworthy of it. That was the whole basis of this argument. So, after this proposition, what they basically did was they took the language of freedom of association and used it to defend an opposite idea, or different idea, different phrasing, which was individual owner freedom of choice. So it wasn't associated with what the white racists were saying in the South, right? And opposing school segregation. And they used the language of America's founding, and they said, we're the ones in favor of racial equality because we're in favor of the rights of all owners, black and white, i.e. the right to discriminate. So they recolored and recast this whole idea, and they called their campaign, Wilson called, remember, Martin Luther King had invoked the Gettysburg Address over and over again in the March on Washington. And we saw a confiding to a journalist a week before, this speech needs to be another Gettysburg Address. That was his objective. Spike Wilson called their campaign Gettysburg 1964. This is the defense of American freedom. Your freedom is at stake. Your absolute freedom. If government takes this right away, this most basic right away from you, it will take all your rights. Ronald Reagan, as I said, had been on the sidelines and wouldn't say anything during this campaign. 2 years later, as he's running for governor, the state Supreme Court, by 4-3, overturns Proposition 14, the Realtors proposition. So Reagan then starts moving week by week through the campaign to adopting the Realtors positions as a populist argument. This is the courts taking away, what voters approved. And he said, if an individual wants to discriminate against Negroes or others from selling or renting his house, it is his right to do so. This is what, and he sort of redefined the language of conservatism in terms of individual freedom in these terms. When fair housing was finally passed in 1968, 3 days after Martin Luther King was assassinated, with soldiers on the steps of the Capitol, so one can picture now. It was seriously undermined, had no enforcement mechanism, and no fundamental administrative enforcement mechanism to this day, because Congress was well aware of what Proposition 14 had shown among the voters. In a moderate liberal state, a bellwether for the country as a whole, predictor of national elections, this could win 65% of the white vote. If this language could be used anywhere, and it could be used not only on this issue, but on any issue. So what are the legacies of this? So one of the legacies is that it would have taken the power of the forces that the Realtors put in place before 1968, which was single-family zoning, the racial covenants, the segregated neighborhoods, the lack of household. These have compounded, only compounded over time. that every effort to do anything serious about it has come up against that same concern. So in 71, Nixon had appointed George Romney as Secretary of HUD, and he took seriously the part of fair housing that says there's both limits on individual discrimination, which haven't been enforced much, but also said the federal government is supposed to affirmatively further fair housing and basically help be instrumental in integrating suburbs. And when Romney took that seriously, Nixon fired him, collapsed that program, and basically said, where people live today is the result of individual freedom of choice by both blacks and whites. So this language became the key tool. So this just shows the old redlining map that shows asthma-related emergency room visits per 1,000 residents. I mean, we all know these consequences. There's continuing segregation in lots of ways today. There was an excellent article series in the Newsday 2 years ago on Long Island Divided about the informal discrimination by brokers and lenders. And frankly, that will only end. And the same way blacks in this country with the same credit scores are turned down for new mortgage loans 50% more than whites. This will only change when people are faced actually by being, by losing their licenses and moving from the industry. So that's one theme of this. I've talked about open communities and single family. We have an enormous household wealth gap. I'm involved in various efforts dealing with that in the housing front. But all these in the end are the result of the weakness of government action, because very strong government action would have needed to overcome these barriers that have been put in place. And they're compounding legacy. If you want to think about it, in Chicago alone, a Duke study last year showed that, black families lost $3 billion in household wealth by not being able to buy homes during the 1950s. And you compound that, because we're now talking about a time, and everybody talks about building household wealth. At the time in the 1950s, you could buy a house in Levittown at less than the cost of renting, if you were allowed to. And although Levittown was built by Jews, and for lots of white ethnic minorities who are now white, it still excluded African Americans, because there had to be somebody to hold the line against, to hold this entire system. But there's a second legacy. This is where I'm going to end on. That this ideology of American freedom, as your freedom without regard to the rights of others, that giving freedom to other people reduces your own, became the ideology for a new National Conservative Party, the one that Charles Wallace Collins had outlined in 1947. And the reason the Realtors' arguments in Prop 14, a lot of the book focuses on what these arguments were in their power, was that it was an argument that was acceptable south and north. So here was a Republican Party with all these, voters potentially from the South who, along with Strom Thurmond, who were willing to vote Republican. And they needed to appeal to them in, protecting the legacies of Jim Crow. They needed to appeal to that, but they needed to do it in a way with the same language and the same arguments that would be acceptable in California or Ohio or Michigan, wherever. This racially neutral language of absolute individual freedom did that. Second, there were at the time two competing strands of conservatism in America, modern conservative movement. One of which was social conservatives, largely Catholic, protect school prayer, limit abortions, so forth. Government control to insist on conformity. And there was a libertarian stream. Government should not be limiting anything. And there were major fights between these. And historians have never really explained how they got resolved. And I think the answer becomes that what the Realtors had outlined as language was, this is in the language of John Gorsuch, who's the grandfather of Neil Gorsuch on the Supreme Court. He was arguing for the Realtors in a case in 1962. And he said, let's see if I can find the quote. Oh, he said, freedom of choice means little to the seller. They invented this concept of absolute freedom of choice to the seller. Even though they're leaving the neighborhood, do they really care? It means little to the seller. But, quote, it is made possible for him to choose the type of neighborhood in which he wishes to live and the associations he and his children will have. So, freedom of choice, what it's really about is community conformity. So here's the use of the language of individual freedom, America's highest value. If you ask people across the political spectrum, what is our country's highest value? It's absolutely individual freedom. Here was the language of individual freedom being used to oppose 100% community conformity. That's a very powerful technique. And it's a technique we can see on issue after issue. We can talk about questions. The third thing that this campaign did was it created a polarizing, transcendent view of what is at stake in American politics. What was at stake in this election is not a $500 fine, or just, how we regulate things. This is the issue of whether government is going to take away all your most basic freedoms. So this becomes a religiously transcendental view of what's at stake in our politics. As a voter in Sacramento, wrote into Sacramento LD during the campaign, said, I'm casting a big yes for Proposition 14. This is our last chance. And this language of last chance and battled freedom is language we hear today. So what's at stake here are two diametrically opposite ideas of what freedom means. One is inclusive freedom that belongs to the nation as a whole, that the rights of others are therefore essential to your own, and that freedom has limits to protect others. And it's just like freedom of speech has always had limitations, always had a balancing act to protect others. And the government isn't created in the Declaration of Independence to secure these rights. So government's job is to balance the rights of all. The alternative notion is exclusive freedom. That freedom is your private property. The rights of others diminish your own, especially those not like you. And there's a narrow particular freedom that gets invented, like this absolute right of sellers. Got invented without respect to the rights of tenants and buyers to buy a home in the first place. And it's elevated. It's a very effective framing technique to elevate this single narrow right as an absolute and say that's the litmus test of freedom. And you can see this being used with guns, which have transformed over the last 50 years. Never, until, even the NRA was in favor of limits on guns in the 1950s and 60s. But this language of absolute freedom, your freedom without regard to those of others, is actually an interesting column by Jim Bowie in the Times in the last 2 days about defining these individuals. The absolute right of a fetus has to be, it's the same notion of an absolute right government can't balance against the rights of others. This is this notion, it's a sacred right. And therefore government has no role and no legitimacy to protect the rights of others. So why don't I stop there and take questions? And I'm happy to answer questions about